Just about time for love to begin. Just about trouble they'll stumble in. From Nailstone streets to dreams out loud, they're just about lost and just about found.
It's loves and tears, life turns about. In our story, just about
10 years ago. Hello, darling. All right. Pack it in board. Do you want them to think we're morons or something? Why, what's up now? I was only being friendly. This, Chris knew, was fairly typical of Paul, totally unaware of the effect his ever-active mouth had on other people. He and Paul had been friends for several years, since they'd been in the Scouts together for what seemed an eternity, but had in fact, Chris knew for a fact, been less than a year before they both got bored and left. Paul was only a few months older than Chris, but given the way the academic year divides, had been in the year above him at school. They had seen each other in school, but that few months' difference in their age had meant that their two paths would never cross in that particular Academy of Excellence, known locally as Old Tumbledown. Its given name was the Nailstone Church of England Primary School, but for as long as Chris could remember, it had been called Old Tumbledown by everyone in the small black country town because of the state of disrepair in which it had existed, since Adam was a lad, as his dad was occasionally heard to say, in one of his rare moments that passed for eloquence. The local council were always going to do something about it, but for as long as anybody could remember, Old Tumbledown had stood there, shabby, uninteresting, a monument to early Victorian architecture, with only the very basic of repairs carried out to ensure that the pupils who went there didn't get wet, dirty, or maimed by falling masonry. It was rumoured that it was to be knocked down and a spanking new replacement built, but this too had been whispered on the streets of Nailstone for as long as Chris could remember. The subject would raise its head every 6 months or so, when the local newspaper had what was described in Fleet Street as a slow news day. The problem was that so little happened in Nailstone that every day was a slow news day. Even though the Herald was only published on Fridays and covered the whole of Paisley Borough Council, it still had to fill its pages with advertisements, local weddings, and school football to make a decent size to actually charge people for. Scouts had been a great leveller where the juvenile values of primary school had no place, and boys of all ages joined in with others and simply got on with it, in this male bastion of toggles, knots and plans of camp that in Chris's case never happened. A firm bond had been formed between these two very different sons of Nailstone. Although both very quickly became bored with Scouts, despite their many differences, they had never become bored with each other, and had always stayed good, even best friends. Paul was the elder of three brothers, abounded in self-confidence, always believing that there was nothing that he couldn't master, no task too difficult, and that everyone he came into contact with instantly liked him. Even when so many of his endeavours failed and other people openly told him that he was a wally, his belief in his own abilities and popularity never seemed to waver. He was tall, athletic, and many girls, as he grew into his skin, would have described him as good-looking, in a gangly, egocentric kind of way. Chris, on the other hand, had an older sister who was so far removed in age to her younger sibling to have been married when he was still a pupil at Old Tumbledown. He had been brought up by older parents who never really got why children and young people had to behave so differently from them, why the clothes they wore had to be so, in their eyes at least, unusual, and his mother in particular held to the view that children should be seen and not heard. His dad was a kindly man who just wanted to be left to his allotment when he came home from work in the foundry at night. He rarely passed comment on anything, and it seemed to Chris that his parents didn't really know each other. In fact, he had often wondered how, or indeed why, they had ever got together. He had occasionally thought about the physical coupling that produced him and Glenys, but found that a concept too repulsive to ponder for more than a few seconds at a time. Still, he had from a very young age held to the view that his dad must be a very brave man. Chris had often remarked that he had grown up with all the disadvantages of being an only child, without any of the advantages. He would realise later in his life that he had a mother who was a stereotypical critical parent, and he felt nothing he did or said was ever quite good enough. Chris had realised at about 13, after meeting Paul's parents and a long chat with his older sister Glenys, that his own parents, particularly his mom, were not typical. Paul's dad laughed a lot, something his old father rarely did, always wanted to know what the lads were up to, told occasional near-the-knuckle jokes, and as treated by Paul as he grew older, more as a friend than an offspring. Paul's mother, for her part, was kind, pretty, in an older type of way, though Chris would have never told Paul that. Dressed in a much more modern way than his own mother would ever have entertained, and had a way of talking to her own children and any other young people she met that suggested she was genuinely interested in what they had to say. Chris had decided on his very first meeting with her that she was the type of woman he wanted to marry. The only way at 17 years old he managed to get as much freedom as he did was an endless stream of lies to his mother as to where he was going and who he was with. It didn't help that on her first meeting with the outgoing, self-assured Paul, Chris's mother had taken an instant dislike to him. Given that it was clear that he could be seen and had every intention of being heard, it came as no surprise really. It simply became easier as the years went on to rarely mention to her that they were out together. Chris knew that this saved a lot of hassle. He never told Paul this, as he firmly believed Paul capable of marching into his house and telling his mother exactly what he thought of her. He'd often pontificated on the subject when he and Chris had chatted about some edict or restriction she had placed on her son. The result of this combination of facts and circumstances meant that Chris was much more reserved than Paul, less content with his lot, and generally more self-effacing. While he lacked a lot of self-confidence, which a casual observer may suggest was more than made up for by his mate, the result was much more amiable character, if a little apologetic at times with others. What he didn't realise was that people, generally young girls of his own age in particular, felt him to be a nice young man, not pushy or arrogant, and the kind of boy a girl could take home to meet her mom without fearing breaking wind or kicking the cat. The other characteristic in Chris that had been observed by the adults in his life was a sensitivity to the needs of others, not usually evident in 17-year-old males. He was also more aware than others, certainly than Paul, of the way people interacted and the effect people can have on those with whom they come into contact. It was with this awareness and sensitivity that had come to the fore after Paul's opening gambit, when the two girls had emerged out of the shop. "Anyway, what do you mean by moron? I was only breaking the ice." Chris had seen this before in Paul, the negative reaction to any suggestion that he may be in some way out of line. "Come on, mate, you can do better than that. You said yourself those two look like they've got a bit more class than the others. I mean, shouting over the road, 'Hello, darling, all right,' how corny is that? What's the next line? What's a nice kid like you doing a place like this? Or, 'Get your coat, love, you've pulled.' It's like listening to something out of a 70s police programme. Go on then, smart-art, you say something if you're so perfect," Paul retorted. I'll shut my gob, and to underline his intent, made a zipping motion across his lips. This was fairly common default for Paul. On the rare occasion he had Chris had crosswords, and came as no surprise to the shyer, yet more easygoing one of the two friends. What he did do, and had done before, was put Chris in the position of being the one that then had to do the talking. He'd always been easy with girls in conversation, having an older sister who had always brought friends home had been a major contribution to this. But he'd never been easy with the opening gambits in a picking up girl scenario. He was aware that his friend's outgoing nature had stood them both in good stead in past encounters of a similar ilk. So, what was he to do now? There were certainly two good-looking girls. He couldn't recall seeing either of them around Nailstone before. He was sure that he'd remember if he had. Both were blonde, the one shorter than the other, but with longer hair. Both were wearing short skirts that flattered what Chris had to admit were two well above average pairs of legs. And the general presentation that greeted his eyes as he said over the road was, to say the least, very pleasant. So he asked himself again, what do I do now? "Do you want a toffee?" said the smiling face of the shorter one of the two girls as she crossed the road towards them, followed a little uncertainly by her friends.
It's loves and tears, life turns about. In our story, just about.